When William stood in the center of that Windsor drawing room and began reading the exact words Diana had written about Camilla, nobody in the room moved. Not the head of the Privy Purse. Not the Chief of Staff. Not King Charles. The silence that followed lasted long enough that several people present would later describe it as the longest moment of their professional lives. Camilla did not cry. She did not speak. She simply sat completely still while the voice of Diana's son carried his mother's words across a room that had not been prepared for them. What Diana had actually written, and what those specific words did to the woman sitting across that polished table, was something no palace briefing, no legal strategy, and 30 years of carefully constructed public image had ever prepared her for. There was one passage in that letter. One question Diana had written. And when William read it aloud, Camilla's eyes closed for 4 seconds. Not in the way a person closes their eyes when they are tired. In the way a person closes their eyes when they have just been handed something they did not expect to feel and do not yet know what to do with. And that moment, those 4 seconds, would change everything. The Windsor drawing room had been arranged the way it always was for serious internal meetings. The furniture had not been moved. The curtains had not been drawn. Nothing about the physical space suggested that what was about to happen inside it would be remembered by everyone present for the rest of their professional lives. William had read the letter privately before he arrived. He had read it twice, standing alone in his study at Kensington Palace. And he had spent the better part of a sleepless night deciding not what to do with it. That decision had been made the moment the forensic authentication was complete. But precisely how to present it, that had taken time. He had decided in the end not to summarize. Not to paraphrase. Not to allow his solicitor or his private secretary to speak on his behalf. He had decided to read it aloud himself. In his own voice. In the room where the people who needed to hear it were sitting. He began with the first page. The legal framework. The property clauses. The formal language Diana had used when she wanted no ambiguity in her meaning. The head of the Privy Purse followed line by line, his reading glasses pushed forward on his nose, his breathing audible in the quiet of the room. Charles sat in the high-backed chair near the fireplace with his hands folded in his lap. Camilla stood near the window. Her chief of staff stood one step behind her left shoulder. William turned to the second page. The language shifted here. And the room felt it before anyone had consciously registered the change. The precise legal cadence of the first page gave way to something more direct, more personal. Diana had always known the difference between writing for a courtroom and writing for a person. And on the second page, she had made a choice that no solicitor had advised her to make, and that no institutional filter had ever softened. She had written Camilla's name. Not a title. Not a reference. Her name. Written in the same deep navy ink. In the same sharp cursive hand. With no prefacing clause and no diplomatic distance. William did not pause. He continued reading. Camilla did not move. She had been standing with her weight evenly distributed, her hands loosely at her sides in the particular posture of someone who has spent decades learning how to occupy public space without giving anything away. That posture did not change. But something behind it did. The people in that room who knew her well enough to read the difference between her public stillness and her private stillness understood immediately that these were not the same thing. Charles looked down at the carpet. The head of the Privy Purse placed his pen flat on the leather ledger in his lap and did not pick it up again. William reached the passage Diana had underlined twice near the bottom of the second sheet and read through it without altering his pace. Then he turned to the third page. And it was there, in the first 4 lines of the final sheet, that the room went entirely silent in a way that nobody in it had anticipated, and nobody who was present would ever fully describe in the years that followed. The first 2 pages of Diana's letter had been written for a courtroom. Precise. Architectural. The kind of language that leaves no space for interpretation because it was never intended to be interpreted. Only enforced. The third page was different. Halfway through the final sheet, the legal cadence stopped entirely. The sentence structure changed. The spacing between lines changed. Even the pressure of the pen against the vellum changed in a way that the forensic analyst had noted in her written report without comment because it was not her place to comment, but which William had noticed immediately when he first read it alone in his study the night before. Diana had shifted registers deliberately. She had written the first 2 pages as a solicitor writes. She had written the 3rd page as herself. She began by stating with complete clarity and no qualifying language that the woman who married Charles after her death was to receive nothing from her personal apartments at Kensington Palace. Not furniture. Not correspondence. Not the small private objects that accumulate across a life and carry the specific weight of a person's interior world. She used the phrase, disposed of. Not donated. Not archived. Not redistributed. Disposed of. The word had been chosen with the same precision she had applied to every other line in the document. Then she left Camilla something. It was the only direct bequest in the entire letter. And it was this: 500 romance novels from Diana's private collection. Each one annotated in the margins in her own handwriting. Observations, reactions, underlinings. The kind of notes a person makes when they are reading alone and have no intention of anyone else ever seeing what they think. And alongside the books, a single bottle of gin with a handwritten note attached. It read, "A toast to placing second." There was no legal weight to this bequest. It could not be enforced. It could not be contested. It existed entirely outside the jurisdiction of the Spencer Trust and the civil probate framework that governed the rest of the document. Diana had known that when she wrote it. She had included it anyway. Not as a legal instrument, but as something that a court could never touch, and that no palace operative could classify or contain. A private communication between 2 women who had never once spoken honestly to each other. Delivered across nearly 3 decades of silence, but there was one more thing on the 3rd page. Something that nobody in that room had expected. William had read through the bequest. The novels, the gin, the 4 words that had landed in the room like something dropped from a considerable height. And he had paused. Not long enough to be theatrical. Long enough to be deliberate. He looked up once briefly at no one in particular. And then he looked back down at the vellum sheet in his hands. Diana had written something else beneath the bequest. Separated from the paragraph above it by a single line of empty space. A gap that on a page this precisely composed was not accidental. It was a question. Not a legal clause. Not a further instruction. A question. Written in the same deep navy ink. Addressed to no institution and no trustee and no court. Addressed to Camilla directly. By name. Diana had asked her this, if the positions had been reversed. If it had been Camilla who was asked to leave. Camilla whose marriage had been described in official documents as irretrievably broken. Camilla whose public image had been reduced to a single defining narrative that she had spent years trying to correct and never fully could. Would she have had the endurance to continue? It was not a cruel question. That was what made it so difficult to sit with. There was no sarcasm in it. No trace of the bitterness that the public had long assumed must exist between these 2 women. It was a question one person asks another when they have decided in some final and irreversible part of themselves to stop pretending the other person is simply an obstacle. And acknowledge that they are, in fact, a human being. Facing their own version of an impossible situation. Diana had looked across the architecture of her own life. The surveillance. The isolation. The systematic dismantling of her credibility by an institution that had decided she was more useful as a problem to be managed than a person to be heard. And she had asked Camilla whether she would have survived it. It was the most intimate thing in the document. It was also the most devastating. Charles had been looking at the carpet when William read those lines. He did not raise his eyes. And Camilla, who had not moved from her position near the window since William began reading, who had maintained the particular external composure that nearly 3 decades of public life had made second nature, experienced something that the people in that room had never seen from her before and would not see again. Her eyes closed. Not in the way a person closes their eyes when they are tired or when they are thinking. In the way a person closes their eyes when they have just been handed something they did not expect to feel and do not yet know what to do with. It lasted 4 seconds. Then she opened them again. The room remained silent. And William folded the third page carefully back along its original crease. Placed it on top of the other 2 sheets. And set them flat on the polished surface of the coffee table without a word. Camilla signed her name with a silver fountain pen she had taken from the writing desk near the window. The signature took approximately 4 seconds. She set the pen down without looking at it. Walked to the private side door on the far left of the drawing room. And left without speaking. Her chief of staff followed. The door closed behind them with the particular quietness of a heavy door in a formal room. The kind of sound that is not a slam and not a click, but something in between that registers in the body before the mind has time to process it. The corridor outside the sovereign's drawing room at Windsor runs for a considerable length before it reaches the private staircase that descends to the internal courtyard. Camilla walked it at her usual pace. Not faster. Not slower. Her chief of staff kept 1 step behind and did not speak. 2 members of her close protection team fell into position without being signaled. The sequence was automatic. Practiced. The kind of movement that happens when a person's body continues performing its professional function while the rest of them is somewhere entirely different. The car was waiting in the inner courtyard. She got in. The door closed. The vehicle cleared the security gate at Windsor and moved onto the road toward London. And for the entire duration of that journey, 45 minutes in light afternoon traffic, Camilla did not make a single telephone call. Not to her legal team. Not to her private secretary. Not to her son Tom. She sat in the back seat of the car with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the window. And the only sound in the vehicle was the low frequency of the road beneath the wheels. Those who have spent long enough inside the orbit of the royal household learn to read the specific grammar of these silences. There is the silence of someone managing their composure for the journey home before allowing themselves to respond privately. There is the silence of someone calculating their next move. And there is a third kind of silence. Rarer. And in its own way more telling than either of the others. The silence of someone who has just encountered something they had been preparing for, and discovered that the preparation had not been sufficient. What happened in the hours that followed was not dramatic. It was not announced. It did not generate a press release or a briefing note or any of the visible apparatus through which the palace typically communicates its decisions to the world. What happened was quieter than that. And considerably more precise. And that precision was the point. Before 9 o'clock that same evening, Camilla's office had received a formal written request delivered through the internal household communication system on plain administrative letterhead. In the measured language of routine institutional correspondence, it asked for a complete inventory of all Spencer family items currently held in palace storage. The request specified a response deadline of 5 working days. It did not explain its origins. It did not need to. At roughly the same hour, a senior member of Camilla's household staff received a telephone call from a number registered to the office of the Privy Purse. The conversation lasted less than 4 minutes. The following morning, that staff member arrived at their desk and spent the first part of the day quietly reviewing the terms of their current contract. A financial arrangement that Camilla's legal team had been constructing with considerable patience over the preceding 18 months was placed under formal review. No explanation accompanied the notification. In the grammar of palace administration, a formal review initiated without explanation is not a question. It is an answer. None of these developments appeared in any newspaper. None were referenced in any official statement. They moved through the internal architecture of the household the way that consequential things always move inside institutions of this kind. Not through corridors that the public can see, but through the ones that have no name and leave no record. The first change appeared on a Tuesday. A researcher who had spent the better part of 6 years monitoring the official royal household website noticed that a single phrase in the section describing Camilla's institutional role had been quietly amended overnight. The previous wording had included a reference to her office's administrative coordination across certain household functions. The new wording did not. The paragraph was otherwise identical. The page carried no update timestamp. There was no accompanying announcement. If she had not been the kind of person who read that page with the specific attention of someone whose professional life depended on noticing exactly this kind of detail, she would not have seen it at all. The second change was physical. A set of sapphire pieces from the Spencer collection, a necklace and matching earrings that Camilla had worn at 2 separate engagements over the preceding year and which had appeared in widely circulated photographs on both occasions, were quietly removed from the palace vault by a member of the Spencer family's private legal representative and transported to Althorpe House on a Wednesday morning. The transfer was logged internally. No press notice was issued. The items simply ceased to be where they had been. And the space they left behind in the inventory was filled with administrative paperwork that confirmed the return of a loan rather than the removal of anything belonging to anyone currently residing in the household. The third change took longer to surface, but it was in some ways the most legible of all to those who understood the internal language of royal protocol. A formal guest list for an upcoming private engagement was returned to Camilla's office with a single amendment. Her name appeared in the third position, not the second. The second position was occupied by William's name. Placed there without explanation or accompanying correspondence, as though the arrangement had always been intended and required no comment. Taken individually, none of these changes constituted an event. A phrase adjusted on a web page. A set of jewelry returned to its legal owner. A name moved one position down a guest list. Each one was on its own entirely explicable by routine administrative process. But the people who lived and worked inside the orbit of the royal household were not required to take them individually. They had spent careers learning to read the accumulation of small adjustments the way a navigator reads weather. Not from any single sign, but from the pattern that emerges when enough signs appear in close enough succession. The pattern was clear. What Diana had set in motion with 3 handwritten pages was not a scandal. It was a recalibration. And recalibrations of this kind inside an institution as practiced as this one do not announce themselves. They simply become the new reality before most people realize the old one has ended. The Royal Horticultural Society engagement in Chelsea had been on the official calendar for months. It was precisely the kind of appearance that palace communications teams describe in their internal briefings as routine. A seasonal fixture. Well attended. Photographically predictable. Requiring nothing from its senior royal participants beyond the practiced choreography of warm greetings and appropriate expressions of interest. The cameras, as they always do, saw more than they were meant to. A veteran royal photographer set up his position at the far end of the formal garden with a long lens and worked methodically through the afternoon. The arrival sequence was where he focused first. Royal arrivals carry their own grammar, legible to anyone who has studied them long enough. The order in which people emerge from vehicles. The distance maintained between bodies during a walk to the entrance. The direction of eye contact in the seconds before the formal greeting line begins. These things are not accidental. They are arranged, rehearsed, and understood by every person participating in them to communicate a specific and intentional message to anyone watching closely enough to receive it. Charles emerged first. William followed, taking his position at his father's right shoulder. A placement that in the internal hierarchy of palace protocol carries a meaning that requires no announcement. Camilla emerged last and fell into step not beside Charles, as she had done at every comparable engagement over the preceding 2 years, but one pace behind and fractionally to his left. The greeting line lasted the better part of 40 minutes. Hundreds of guests moved through it in the warm afternoon light. And the 3 senior royals performed the occasion with the fluency that this family has refined across generations. Across 140 frames taken throughout the full duration of the afternoon, Camilla and William did not appear in the same image without another person between them. Not once. In every frame where both were visible, there was always someone occupying the space that might otherwise have required them to stand in direct proximity. There was one moment approximately halfway through the afternoon where the geometry of the greeting line brought Camilla and William face to face across a distance of perhaps 4 feet. He extended his hand. She took it. The handshake lasted the correct number of seconds. Not one fraction longer. Not one fraction shorter. They both produced the appropriate expression. The cameras captured it from several angles simultaneously, and every resulting image showed two people performing with complete technical proficiency. The public version of a relationship that the private version no longer resembled. Charles did not go to Clarence's house immediately. Those who tracked his movements that evening noted that he remained inside Windsor for considerably longer than the meeting required. The sovereign's drawing room had been empty for more than an hour before his personal protection officer logged the departure. What he did in that intervening time was not recorded. The room offered no account of itself. But people who had observed Charles across decades of private pressure understood that he processed difficult things slowly and alone, and that the version of him who emerged from that processing was always quieter and more deliberate than the one who had entered it. He arrived at Clarence's house after dark. He did not bring his private secretary. He did not bring a legal advisor or a member of his household staff. He went upstairs directly to Camilla's sitting room and closed the door behind him. The two protection teams positioned in the corridor outside operated on the standing instruction that applied to all private conversations between senior members of the household, which was to say they heard nothing and logged nothing beyond the time of arrival and the time of departure. What is known comes from the residue that private conversations leave in the behavior of the people who have them. Camilla appeared at a scheduled public engagement the following morning. She was composed, punctual, and gave no indication in her expression or her manner that the previous 24 hours had been anything other than routine. Those who had known her for a long time and watched her closely noted only one small deviation from her usual presence. She did not wear jewelry that morning. Not the absence of a specific piece. Simply no jewelry at all. Where there was almost always something. A strand of pearls. A brooch. A bracelet. The choice registered with the people who noticed these things and was not explained by anyone. Charles had told her something the previous evening that caused her to make that choice. The most credible account suggested that the conversation had contained something neither of them had ever discussed directly in nearly 3 decades together. Charles had told her that he had known a document existed. Not its contents. Not its location. But its existence. The fact that Diana in the final weeks of her life had executed something formal and private and placed it outside the reach of the palace had been known to him since the early years of their marriage. He had been told by a member of his own legal team who had encountered a reference to it in the course of reviewing Diana's estate correspondence. He had made a decision at that time not to search for it. He had believed that time would render it irrelevant. He had been wrong. Camilla listened to this without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for long enough that Charles felt the need to say something further and found that he had nothing further to say. She did not ask him why he had not told her. Perhaps because she already understood the answer. Perhaps because after everything that had been said in that Windsor drawing room, there was a version of honesty between them that no longer required the question to be spoken aloud. This story was not about a legal document. It was not about property clauses or forensic authentication or the intricate machinery of the Spencer Trust. What this story was actually about was a question. A question Diana wrote in the final weeks of her life, addressed to the woman who would one day take her place. If the positions had been reversed, would she have survived it? Diana had looked across the architecture of her own life. The surveillance. The isolation. The systematic dismantling of her credibility by an institution that had decided she was more useful as a problem to be managed than a person to be heard. And she had asked Camilla whether she would have endured what she endured. It was not a weapon. It was an acknowledgement that the institution destroys everyone who stands too close to it. Not with one blow, but with years of quiet pressure. With informal arrangements that exist only because no one has challenged them yet. With proximity that is mistaken for security until the door closes and you realize you were never really inside. Camilla had spent 30 years building proximity to the center of this institution. She had absorbed the public hostility. She had been patient, strategic, careful. And on that afternoon in the Windsor drawing room, she learned that the preparation had not been sufficient. William had not done this in anger. He had not done it in grief. He had done it because a legal boundary existed. because it had been constructed specifically to be enforced at exactly this kind of moment. And because he was now the person with the standing to enforce it. Diana had written those pages in August of 1997 in a private house on Spencer Land, beyond the reach of the Royal Archives and the Lord Chamberlain's office and every institutional mechanism that had spent 15 years trying to manage what she said and when she said it and to whom. She had written them before William was old enough to understand what she was building. Before anyone inside the palace had seriously considered the possibility that she was thinking that far ahead. She had always been thinking that far ahead. They had simply never been paying close enough attention. Subscribe to the Meghan Markle Report for more royal investigations. Drop your thoughts below. What would you have done if you were William? I read every single comment. See you in the next one.